Hello, my name is Earl Ijames, Curator with the North Carolina Museum of History. And it is my pleasure to be with you at our annual lecture for the 156th commemoration of the end of the Civil War at historic Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina. The Emancipation Proclamation was like a burst of heaven, a quote from Frederick Douglass, who was one of the leading abolitionists and freedom seekers of American history. Now, I must confess that this is not really Frederick Douglass nor Abraham Lincoln, but these are two of my historic reenactor friends at one of our United States Colored Troops symposiums, actually at the Hilton in Greenville, North Carolina in 2009. But they did a masterful job of interpreting Lincoln and Douglass. The Emancipation Proclamation was like a burst of freedom, according to Frederick Douglass, because for the first 70 years of American history, it was not legal for people of African descent to serve in the United States Army. And so what the Emancipation Proclamation did was to reverse an old federal law called the Federal Militia Act of 1792. And what it did is it facilitated the enlistment of enslaved and free people of color into the federal army, so that escaped freedom seekers could now officially fight against slavery. The first Confiscation Act allowed the Union to employ persons of African descent in the war effort. The second Confiscation Act, as I mentioned, repealed the 1792 Militia Act that had previously barred African Americans from serving in the Army. And with that, the U.S. War Department authorized the raising of what were called segregated United States troop regiments. And under the second act, the United States War Department authorized the raising of what was called the African Brigade back then, but later renamed the United States Colored Troops. The brigade's white officers were abolitionists who were handpicked by President Abraham Lincoln. And according to Abraham Lincoln, the United States Colored Troops fought for their freedom, and without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. And the primary center for raising United States Colored Troops in the state of North Carolina was a contraband camp called James City, located between the Trent and the Neuse rivers outside of New Bern. And that is where the majority of the troops were raised. This 1850s Colt revolver belonged to a man named William Henry Singleton, who was born enslaved in Craven County sometime in the early 1830s. And at the beginning of the Civil War, as I mentioned, it was not legal for people of African descent to serve in the United States Army. But the Confederate States were no longer bound by federal law, and they sought the service of enslaved and free people of color in many capacities. And in this sense, Singleton sought permission from his slaveholder to serve in the Confederate cavalry. And after the December 1862 Battle of Kinston, North Carolina, Singleton escaped to James City, only to be detained and suspected as a Confederate spy. When the officers from the North Carolina Confederate Cavalry sought return of Singleton per the Union contraband policy, Union officials refused their request, and instead, Singleton helped recruit the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry at the Union-occupied New Bern, North Carolina. And the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry was later federalized as the 35th United States Colored Troops in 1864, right before their first and only battle of Florida and Olustee in February of 1864. But in the beginning, they were not issued firearms. And before they actually saw action in Florida, they were relegated to digging latrines and other menial labor tasks. So Singleton insisted on arms and uniforms, and he literally escaped across the Neuse River with some of the personal recruits. He trained them with corn stalks, according to his book, Recollection of My Slavery Days, which is a autobiography that we sell in our North Carolina Museum of History gift shop. And he used his skills to acquire in the Confederate Army to train and to help train the 35th United States colored troops. This is an image of a reunion of the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry that was again federalized as the 35th United States Colored Troops. And this is a photograph from my personal collection that I literally found in the dumpster in Berkeley County, and another story altogether, but we were able to dust it off and get a copy to the archives and get provenance on it. The photograph of the United States Colored Troop 35th Infantry was taken at the Prince Hall Mason Lodge around 1905 in Plymouth, North Carolina. Some of the people in the image, notably William Henry Singleton front and center, who raised the regiment, and second to his left in the wide brimmed hat is a man named Private Luke Martin. And you may say, well, how did you get that information, Earl? And so that's a great question. About 12 years after that photograph was taken in 1905, Private Luke Martin remarried and became a Baptist minister, or a minister in New Bern. And his youngest son, Luke Martin, was born in 1917. You see him pictured in the slide here, when Pastor Luke, or Private Luke Martin, was 80 years young. And according to the information that I got in this interview from Mr. Luke Martin Jr., his mother was 39 in 1917. And this was at a 2008 interview at his home that his father, Private Luke Martin, built in New Bern around 1900. And the family still lives in that home today. And he shared lots of information with me that day, and we had the privilege to interview him and record the interview with none other than Alex Haley Jr. on the patio of his home in New Bern. And you can see another image, and an image of Mr. Luke Martin Jr. looking at a portrait of his father, Pastor Luke Martin, that was taken sometime around 1900. One of the 1,053 soldiers of the 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry was another man named Private John Gaskell from Washington, North Carolina, which I like to point out is the original Washington, America, incorporated just after the American Revolution in 1783. So not Little Washington, but the original Washington. And one of the heroes of the war and American history from Washington, North Carolina, is a man named John Gaskell, who escaped slavery and sought freedom again at James City, and enlisted with Luke Martin and William Henry Singleton in that 1st North Carolina Colored Infantry. And this is an artifact that's in our museum collection that we found in Pitt County, which is what we think could be some of the earliest dog tags, or we call them identification tags. And this is one of John Gaskell from the 35th United States Colored Troops, and you can see his name, John Gaskell, here and on the back of the tags. And after researching, I noted that he was 54 years young when he enlisted in that regiment. So another regiment raised at New Bern and James City was the 2nd North Carolina Colored Infantry, which was later federalized into the 36th United States Colored Troops. And what you see on the screen here is a discharge of a man named Private Samuel Sutton. And the 36th United States Colored Troops, as again was mustered as the 2nd North Carolina, and Sutton enlisted from a town called Hertford, North Carolina, in Perquimans County, not to be confused with Hertford County, North Carolina, where Murfreesboro and Ahoskie is, but several miles to the east in Hertford, North Carolina, Perquimans County, also boasts the earliest known monument to United States colored troops in America, a monument that was erected by little church ladies there in 1910. But the 36th was a very famous regiment from the Civil War, and it was well known in 1910 and the years after the Civil War because they were the first Union regiment, white or black, to occupy the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia on the 4th of April of 1865. And it's important to reiterate that these regiments were segregated initially when they were formed. And so the 36th United States Colored Troops, or the 2nd North Carolina Colored Infantry, was the absolute first regiment to occupy the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, to help end the Civil War. And so the United States War Department reassigned the 36th to Texas in 1865 to help spread the word of the Emancipation and the passage of the 13th Amendment by Congress in Texas. And that is in what people today call Juneteenth, when General Major Gordon Granger arrived at Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, with United States colored troops in tow to help spread the news of freedom and the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's important to note that freedom obviously outlawed slavery for our enslaved African American ancestors, but notably freedom outlawed slavery that was a curse on the entire society and afflicted white, black, and Indian, young and old alike. This is an image of the United States Colored Troops 32nd Infantry Regiment reenactors, and the names Tom Hancock, Mel Reed, Harvey Gooding, Malcolm Beach, who's the president of the United States Colored Troops Living History Association, and Dr. Joseph Askew. And what is not pictured on the screen is a discharge for Private Charles Jones, who enlisted in the 37th Colored Infantry from Jones County in 1864. And when he was discharged in Raleigh in 1865, he received a payment of $99.34. And so the NCCI, or the 3rd North Carolina Colored Infantry, was federalized again into the 37th United States Colored Troops. So the 14th United States Colored Heavy Artillery Regiment was raised in Morehead City, North Carolina. Frank Worthington was a soldier who in 1860 was identified as a fugitive in the 1860 census. This is a reenactor doll of one of the soldiers, Private Frank Worthington, who, according to the slave schedule, was a fugitive from justice or had escaped slavery in 1860. And between 1860 and 1864, when he enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, he hid out from slave patrols and Confederate armed patrols to enlist in the 14th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. And you can see their official regimental flags here and the 36 star flag that is part of the Union in 1865. This is an image of the dedication and the family reunion of Private Frank Worthington and the marker dedication in Wilson, North Carolina in August 2011. And I'm pictured on your left, the marker or the official Civil War Veterans Administration marker to Frank Worthington, and again, Dr. Malcolm Beach, and Frank Worthington's great-great-great-grandson, David Wellington. Well, you may say, Earl Ijames, why is he Wellington and his great-great-grandfather Worthington? Well, good question, because again, as Frank Worthington was a, quote, fugitive from justice, when many of these men showed up in New Bern or Morehead City to enlist in the United States colored troops, they were literally fugitives from justice, many times with broadsides on the side of pine trees with their likeness, description, and their names. And so many of these soldiers literally changed their names to evade Confederate Home Guard and slave patrols in order to enlist in the Army. And we were able, through research of genealogy and United States colored troop pension applications, to see where he admitted that he had changed his name from Worthington to Wellington, and later his family left Wilson, North Carolina, and moved north to Washington, D.C., where many of their descendants still live today. So we see on the screen here another soldier who enlisted in a separate regiment of the United States Colored Troop called the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry. And this is an original oil portrait that's currently on display in our Story of North Carolina exhibit here at the North Carolina Museum of History. And his name is Parker D. Robbins, or Staff Sergeant Parker D. Robbins, which was an actual ranking. For those who don't know military jargon, the Staff Sergeant is usually in charge of daily command of a company of 100 or so men and executing the commands of the superior officers. So he was Staff Sergeant Parker D. Robbins, who was born a free man of color in Gates County, North Carolina. He's part Choanoke or Chowan Indian, part African American, and part European American. And he enlisted in the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry, and the 2nd United States Colored Cavalry was enrolled in Norfolk, Virginia, and participated in the Overland Campaign in 1864 in Virginia, where they were also among the first regiments to occupy Richmond, Virginia, along with the 36th United States Colored Troops. Parker Robbins rode on his horse into Richmond and helped to occupy and end the Civil War. And after the war, Robbins served as one of the first Black Republican delegates to the 1868 Constitutional Convention that was a mandate after the war for North Carolina and many of the other southern states to be readmitted to the Union. We had to redraw constitutions, and Robbins was one of the Republican delegates to that convention. In 1869, he was later elected to the state legislature to represent Bertie County as a Republican legislator in the House. And Robbins, who was a mechanic and a farmer by trade, he also received 2 patents from the U.S. Patent Agency in the 1870s. And after that, he later relocated as a business proprietor to the Cape Fear River Basin in Duplin County, where he owned and operated a sawmill and a turpentine distillery. And he also built a steamboat where he sent his own goods down the river, down the Northeast Cape Fear River, to Wilmington and the port. And if you drive through the town of Magnolia, North Carolina, in Duplin County today, you'll see many fine Victorian homes that he either built or had a hand in building. And the image that you see, or the oil portrait that you see on the screen, was actually donated to the museum in 1977 by his great-granddaughter. Now, many of us have also heard about General Sherman's March and Gone with the Wind and so forth. And it actually did not end in Savannah, Georgia, but it culminated at historic Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina in April of 1865. And so as Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, his route leaving Savannah brought him through Columbia, South Carolina, and across the PD River Basin in Richmond County, North Carolina, into Fayetteville. But his primary objective in North Carolina was to capture the railroad hub of Goldsboro, North Carolina, which was founded in 1847 and instantly became a catalyst to the longest railroad on earth, which is called the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad from the Virginia line south to the port at Wilmington in North Carolina, 140 miles. And so by 1855, the North Carolina Railroad had been completed as an east-west corridor from Goldsboro to Charlotte, North Carolina, or the Trade City. And the North Carolina Railroad was the most modern on earth at the time, and during the Civil War, the Confederate state of North Carolina actually hired enslaved and free people of color $40 a month rate to work on that line during the war. And so the railroad junction was very vital to the Confederate supply lines between General Robert E. Lee, as I previously mentioned, in the Army of Northern Virginia and Richmond and Virginia and in the North, and also General Joseph E. Johnston and the largest Confederate army, which was here in eastern North Carolina and back into Raleigh and what is now Durham. So when Sherman captures Goldsboro, he immediately forms a regiment of United States colored troops that are renamed by the United States War Department the 135th United States Colored Troop Infantry Regiment. And it was after the Battle of Bentonville when Sherman decided he needed to capture Raleigh. And at that time, there was no continuous road from that new town of Goldsboro, North Carolina, to the capital city of Raleigh. And so the 135th Regiment actually built what were called corduroy roads, which are essentially pine trees or timbers that are cut about 24 feet in length and that are about 12 inches in diameter at the small end, and they are cross-tied in a roadbed to form a road so that the soldiers and the wagons and all the supply lines that were in General Sherman's army, that by that time had swelled from 60,000 soldiers to 100,000, which included the soldiers that had joined him just below Goldsboro in Duplin County, coming up from Fort Fisher. And so what you see on the screen is one of the soldiers who enlisted in the 135th Regiment while Sherman was still in Wayne County, a man named Private Jack Sherrod. And Sherrod, and this photograph was cropped from his United States pension application. And it was also at the research request of his great-great-grandson, Mr. Philip Sherrod, who literally still lives in the home that Jack Sherrod built in Wayne County after the Civil War in 1881. And on the right of the screen, you see another part of Sherrod's pension application from the United States Pension Bureau. So the 135th, as I mentioned, actually began formulation as a pioneer battalion when General Sherman was still in the swamps of Savannah, Georgia, and across the Savannah River from South Carolina. And he really needed to form this corps in order to get his 60,000 troops out of Savannah and to capture the South Carolina capital of Columbia, which is next. And as I mentioned, from Columbia, he ventured across the state line of North and South Carolina and the Yadkin and Pee Dee River Basin into Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he captured the Confederate arsenal at Fayetteville, and that is also the site of the Civil War Reconstruction Center and Museum here in North Carolina in Fayetteville. And after leaving Fayetteville, we know that he participated at the historic and the largest battle in North Carolina at Bentonville, which is just west of Goldsboro in Johnston County, and then from Goldsboro again, came back through Johnston County into Wake County and captured the capital city of Raleigh. And from Raleigh, Sherman went over to Bennett Place to help the final surrender and negotiate the final surrender of April 1865, which was the largest surrender of Confederate troops in the Civil War, more than 93,000 Confederate soldiers who were under the command of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. But just before that, the other death knell in the fall of the Confederacy and the end of the war was Fort Fisher, which Fort Fisher was the largest earthen fort in the history of the world. It was primarily constructed by enslaved and free people of color who had been employed in many capacities at Fort Fisher. And the Union needed to capture it in order to stop the blockade running that was financing the Confederate Army that was going up the railroad lines into North Carolina and Virginia and helping General Johnston and General Lee continue the war effort. And Confederate Robert E. Lee declared that if Fort Fisher fell, then the Confederate states would soon follow suit. So after a miserably failed attempt in December 1864 to capture the fort, the Union Army and Navy reloaded to launch the largest amphibious assault in the history of the world at that time before D-Day. Now just think of that for a moment. We have seen images of, say, the 81st and the 82nd Airborne Division out of Fort Bragg when they landed at Normandy Beach on D-Day in June of 1944 during World War II. And what an awesome sight that was from the old black and white film. Well, there's no film that existed, or there was no film or cinematography that existed at the end of the Civil War other than tintypes. And there are no known tintypes of the capture of Fort Fisher, just these lithographs that you see on the screen. But you can imagine thousands of United States colored troops landed in the cold, almost icy waters of the South Atlantic off of Fort Fisher and the beach in Wilmington to capture the Confederate behemoth of Fort Fisher. And it culminated with the surrender of the Battery Buchanan to one of those United States colored troop regiments, the 27th United States colored troops, which were raised primarily in the state of Ohio and were on an expeditionary force here in North Carolina to help capture Fort Fisher. And after the awesome sight and spectacle of the United States colored troops capturing Fort Fisher, that is when the United States House of Representatives relented and actually voted to pass the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery. The United States Senate had actually passed the 13th Amendment in August of 1864, but the United States House of Representatives insisted on a military victory at Fort Fisher before they could vote on the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery. As I mentioned, Union General William T. Sherman's march ended at historic Bennett Place, which is near present-day Durham, North Carolina, which didn't exist in 1865. Quite frankly, Durham was a railroad station that was called Duke Station. Durham County had not even been formed. It would later be formed in 1881. And this was literally in Orange County at a farm of a man named James Bennett. And the largest negotiation for the surrender of Confederate troops took place on the farm of James Bennett, which is the site of historic Bennett Place in Durham County, North Carolina. And this is where the 100,000 troops ended their Shermans March that originally started in Chattanooga, Tennessee, through Atlanta, Georgia, to Savannah, Georgia, to Columbia, South Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Goldsboro, Raleigh, and finally Durham, North Carolina. And by that time, Sherman's army had been living on the land in 60-mile swaths, taking food from nearly every farm in its reach and every plantation and every house. And it was commonly said that there was not a single chicken left in the whole city of Raleigh except for the weather vane that sits across from Christ Church, across from the state capitol in Raleigh. But what's interesting that happens along Sherman's Way, when they are taking food, they are literally ignoring the cowpeas, or what we call black-eyed peas, that the formerly enslaved people are kind of harboring for themselves and feigning to feed to the livestock. And of course, Sherman's army doesn't want them. So from 1865 to the present, on New Year's Day and many days afterwards, black-eyed peas were the only real staple crop available to feed people at a time of near famine and starvation at the end of the war. And it's a crop that was originally brought from West Africa on slave ships to Virginia originally and spread and currently planted and cultivated throughout the southeastern United States. And a New Year's tradition every day, every New Year's Day since 1865. So a recap, let's talk again about United States colored troops and also what happened to the United States colored troops. As the war ended, the Congress ratified the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, and of course that amendment must go out to the states to be ratified, with 3/4 of the states mandating ratification in order for it to become law and an actual amendment to the United States Constitution. And so on December the 6th, 1865, the state of North Carolina ratified the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, where it reads that slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except as a punishment for a crime whereof that party would have been duly convicted. That's another topic. But what we did here in North Carolina was to call a legislative session to ratify that amendment. And when we ratified it at a session that was called at the historic state capitol in November and December 1865, one of the resolutions passed at that convention was a resolution calling for the removal of the United States colored troops from the state of North Carolina. And what you see here on the screen is a scan from the Constitution Convention Journal from the State Archives, which reads, resolution asking for the removal of colored troops from North Carolina. Resolved that the president of the convention, in behalf of this body, request the president of the United States, if not incompatible with the public interest, to order the removal from the state of North Carolina at the earliest practicable period of all the colored troops now in service of the United States within the said limits of the state of North Carolina, as the presence of the troops is, in the opinion of the convention, very injurious to the colored people and excessively annoying to the white people. And this was a contingency for the state of North Carolina to ratify the 13th Amendment, which the state did ratify and pass the resolution. The United States War Department accepted the resolution, even though the commissions of the United States colored troops in many instances had not been expired or had not been filled. And just as a backup, the commissions were usually 1, 2, or 3-year enlistments of these troops that in many instances ended in June of a year 1864 or June of 1865. And all of the United States colored troops commissions expired in June of 1866. So as of December 1865, the United States colored troops regiments that you see, some of them listed on the screen, were within the bounds of the state, and they were ordered to remove themselves from the limit of the states, and the War Department reassigned them to Texas. And as you see, and I showed earlier, the discharge of the 36 United States colored troop soldier Samuel Sutton was actually at Brazoria, Texas. And so that is where many of the enlistments expired for the colored troops in Texas as they spread the news of Juneteenth, or the end of slavery, and the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution that outlawed slavery. So thank you, and in the words of Abraham Lincoln, the United States colored troops not only fought for freedom, they helped to save our Union, and I'll add, from the scourge of slavery. Thank you.